Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'll be discussing The Power That Preserves, the third book in the first Thomas Covenant trilogy by Stephen R. Donaldson. Now, I will try to warn you that I'm going to try to not be too long-winded here, but I honestly just do have a lot to say about this book, so it might turn into a giantish review, pun intended, to an extent here. Now, this being the last book in the trilogy, I do need to start by talking a bit about the previous books, especially in this instance where The Power That Preserves very much is the complete ending for so many different pieces that were set up in the first two books. So, Lord Foul's Bane started on a bit of a rough patch for me. It was wonderfully written, and it was really well done, but the abrasive main character in Thomas Covenant is just something very different, and it was really hard for me to get into because of that reason. I've heard a lot of people say the same. They really love the story, they love the land, but Thomas Covenant is a hard character to get used to. And his anger and his actions, like the rape of the young girl Lena, his unwillingness to believe in what's going on around him no matter what happens, and his unwillingness to fight for the land, it all is hard for the first book, but it's all very necessary aspects to his journey throughout the trilogy and to where he ends up. Donaldson certainly does not for a second take the reader through the normal hero's journey either. In Lord Foul's Bane, the first book, Covenant reluctantly goes on the quest for the Staff of Law, but even to the end, he maintains his unbelief that it's not real and refuses really to help, and his anger and bitterness are a stark contrast to what we see from everyone else in the land, where they live in this kind of harmony with the earth, and all of these negative emotions are really looked at as things of Lord Foul and not things that they normally see in themselves. This continues in the Ill Earth War, where Thomas Covenant once again is brought back to the land and again rails against being summoned and refuses to act to help the land fight in the war that's coming against Lord Foul. This time, though, he is forced to face the consequences of some of his actions and inactions in the first book, and really the big one is him meeting Elena, who is the daughter of Lena, who he had assaulted in the first book. He has to acknowledge his guilt that he has about her, and really the lives around her as well, and what's happened to them based on what he did. And when he's unable to save her, this pushes him over the edge. The Power That Preserves then finally opens with Covenant back in the real world, but not in a good way. He can't eat, he can't sleep, and he's really at his breaking point. He goes into a rage, he destroys his house around him, and he ends up injuring himself. And slowly doesn't really know what to do, just starts wandering aimlessly, desperately seeking some sort of connection to humanity, to the world around him. And we see with his core unbelief there, but also the emotions and the things he felt from being in the land, he can't reconcile the two, and the thing that he feared the most, it seems, is finally happening. He is beginning to quite literally be driven mad by all that has happened. Finally, after refusing the first summons by High Lord Moram because he wants to try to save a young girl who was bitten by a snake, he is then pulled back into the land, and he sees the hopelessness of the situation. 7 years have passed since he was there this time, and Lord Foul has raised these near limitless armies, and also has put this preternatural winter on the land, keeping anything from growing, and really looking like a pretty hopeless situation. And here's where the dual storytelling really comes to the forefront again and is really shown. I talked about in my review of the first book how the story I read and the story that was written seemed to be pretty different in a lot of ways. I was reading Covenant's struggles with coming to terms with his leprosy and the loss of his family while he was acting in the land, and it became very clear in the later entries that this kind of dual narrative of both what's happening in the land and what's happening in Covenant's world and in his mind is completely intentional. Donaldson really gives a whole new meaning to depth of story with these simultaneous events taking place and the multiple effects that they have. In the land, the heart of the conflict is Lord Foul. He's despite, he's fear, he's hatred. all of this like a physical force slowly destroying the land, and we see the armies of Foul even use magical attacks that seem to poison the land, and this shows this covenant's struggle with leprosy. Like the Lord's, he's trying to stay away from passion and anger that will lead a leper to dangerous thoughts, but despair has taken a hold on him, and he feels that he really can't stop it. We see Covenant's physical sickness, his leprosy, as a manifestation in the land in some of these attacks. His emotional struggle plays out so well. His core unbelief, his refusal to recognize what's happening around him, cuts two ways. He doesn't believe the land is real, but he can't help but feel for those he befriends in the land and for those he in truth loves. He doesn't believe in himself having any power to help, but at the same time that makes him in some ways the only one that can help. Covenant quickly in the story becomes consumed with rage and a single-mindedness that he will go destroy Lord Foul. But we see that while the lack of passion of many in the land has held them back, this other direction, this other extreme is also not the answer and really can only lead to more pain. And that pain really is explored in this book. I briefly mentioned that in Ill-Earth War, he had to face Elena, his daughter that he created through his actions, and also some of the other people around her and other people he'd affected. In the final book, he has to face the people that are actually the hardest for him to face, being Saltheart Foamfollower, who befriended him when nobody else did originally, and who he felt like he truly failed, and Lena herself, whose entire life was destroyed essentially because of Covenant's actions. And having to deal with these people, including Triok as well, who had always wanted to marry Lena, and even some who are coming back from beyond the grave to face him, we do really see that he has to face all of this, and it's such an important part for his development and for the story of the land in general. And Covenant coming to terms with his situation, with himself, is again part of the parallel storytelling. Everything he's had to go through has been necessary for him, but it's also been necessary to save the land. And I feel that Covenant's growth as a person and the changes in him is a very satisfying ending, but also it's a very satisfying ending that we get for the land as well. Now to this point, I've tried to avoid any spoilers, but I do want to get into some spoilerish territory as I discuss the ending and what it signifies on a deeper level. So at this point, if you do want to skip the spoiler section, go to the description, and I will have a timestamp down there of where you can skip to in order to go past. With that, I want to jump into my final thoughts on the ending of the trilogy. And the first thing I want to point out is that we really get to see in this book how much control Lord Foul had over so many of the events in the other books. Almost everything that happened, every major plot point in action that happened around Covenant, things he did, things others did, so much of it all played into Lord Foul's final plan and into the final ending that Lord Foul had in store. Covenant continuously sees Lord Foul as essentially an extension of himself, like he's the one who's causing all of this somehow because he's brought into the land, and he still sees this as a dream and Lord Foul the enemy, but really that's how he sees himself as well. But it really became clear to me, as I touched on above, that Lord Foul is really the manifestation of not just his leprosy, but his negative emotions and despondency toward the disease. I still can't help but see the parallels between Thomas's internal struggles and the struggle of the land. The land is being poisoned by this unstoppable force, this darkness, these dark emotions, and it's this sickness, and it definitely represents everything that Covenant is going through as a person and trying to deal with it, but also not accepting that there's any way he can ever get past it. Foul isn't so much a physical presence that can be destroyed, and there's no cure for Covenant's disease. He has to learn that bitterness will only make things worse, and the secret to being able to live with his situation and with his leprosy is to be able to still laugh, to have joy, and that's really the key to his survival. It's a hard lesson for Covenant to learn, but he realizes it's the only way he can defeat Lord Fowl. I was also very surprised by the final passage where, still on the cusp of death, Covenant talks to the creator of the land. And this really gives a much stronger point in favor of the land being real than I thought that Donaldson would give at all. I really saw the two narratives, and book 2 did lean a lot more toward it being real, but then book 3 leaned a lot more toward it not. I do think, despite this big push, I think it's still very much left open to interpretation, and I really think that that is important. So there was, allegedly, there was another force that chose Covenant for the trial, but it also confirms that he did have absolute free will to act as he wanted, whether it was good or bad. He could either save or destroy the land, but his decisions were his own. And despite the push toward being real, I still think the crafting, like I commented, does allow for both sides. Covenant certainly still doesn't believe in any of it, but whether or not the land is only a dream, I feel like through this trilogy, it really did take a life of its own, and through in the book too, the land is real because the people there are real to Covenant, even if he doesn't want to admit it. And like a well-written series like this, we know that even if it's just a story, even if it's not real, it can get a life of its own through the storytelling, and that can very much make something feel real and alive. This series, with each entry delving deeper into the land and deeper into Covenant's psyche, has made it clear that Donaldson has written a masterpiece with this first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant. All my complaints about Lord Fowl's Bane were addressed and then some in the next 2 books, and I maintain that The Ill-Earth War was nearly a perfect book, barring one glaring problem, and The Power That Preserves, I will just say it, it was perfect. It was a perfect entry in its own merit, and it was the perfect end to this series. While this series will certainly be hard for some readers to get into based on the main character and the dense structure of the story, I have to strongly recommend persevering, as this series will absolutely reward you. This is one of the strongest pieces of fiction I have ever read. Full stop. Donaldson really makes you feel like you're a part of the land, like you're there, that you're witnessing these things with the characters, and you feel not just the good things, but the sickness, the darkness in the land as well. The prose is fantastic. The characters' journeys we see are supremely well done and very unique, and the world building, the history you feel for the land is also just so well done. I am so glad that I continued through this series, even after my somewhat middling reaction to the first book, and I highly recommend this series for fans of literature in general. With that, that's my review of The Power That Preserves. I would love to hear your thoughts on this if you've also read up to this point as well. So let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, then feel free to give it a like, and if you want to see more of my videos, then feel free to subscribe.